Welcome to Facing the Moment, brought to you by the Foundation for Self-Leadership. In these episodes, we will address various crises and focus on how to navigate them with abundant fortitude and a bit of hope. As we discuss relevant observations together, we will identify meaningful actions that will generate valuable insights. You can download all episodes on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube.
I welcome our listeners to this new episode. Friends, I hope you would agree with me that every person longs to be seen, respected, valued, and treated with dignity. Yet it is sad to acknowledge that throughout history, dignity has too often been denied to individuals and groups because of issues revolving solely around race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, nationality, refugee or immigrant status, or countless other differences. In the United States, for example, the history of race reflects both extraordinary courage and profound injustice. It tells the story of slavery, violence and oppression, segregation, and the long struggle for civil rights. It also reminds us that progress has never been automatic. Every generation has been called to continue the work. Today, many people, especially people of color, wonder whether that progress, which was still far, far from being mature, is slowing, being challenged, or being even reversed. For Black people, I dare say, the situation in the US was far from being truly democratic, unlike how many other communities have felt. For them and for many seeing it through their experience, our American experiment was still far from being great. Most of us want to contribute, but remain uncertain about how to engage constructively in conversations around race. Weary of polarization, we end up carrying grief, anger, fear, disappointment, or growing cynicism. Today's conversation is not about assigning blame or attempting to advocate for one point of view. It is about something much deeper. How do we preserve our humanity when fear, prejudice, misunderstanding, and injustice threaten to divide us? How do we pursue justice without surrendering compassion? How do we tell difficult truths while honoring the dignity of every human being? And what does self-leadership, the way we understand it through the IFS Lens, look like when there is racial tension in our workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, or even in our own hearts? Joining me today is someone whose life and work have been devoted to these questions. Our hope today is not simply to understand racial tension more clearly. It is rather to explore together how we might uphold dignity, cultivate courage, and contribute to a more just and compassionate future, especially in racially charged times. Requina, welcome. It's good to have you today.
Hi, Toufic. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Of course. Thank you for being with us. Requina Barnes, MSW, is an IFS-trained social worker who has dedicated her career, like I said, to helping encourage and empower people to live full lives and effectively navigate through their life's traumas. Unfortunate discrimination at the workplace deepened Requina's resolve to be of service to others, especially those who face similar situations. She served individuals and groups in her circles in various capacities. Being an IFS assistant trainer is one such example. Requina held a psychotherapy private practice for years, through which she worked primarily with men, women, and couples of color. An active past board member of Black Therapist Rock, she has been involved in training programs for members of that organization. Requina is a legacy healing coach. She inspired many a student in her roles as adjunct professor at Curry College and as advisor at Boston University, and I believe she continues to do so. And I am pleased to say our guest today has been very active with the Foundation for Self-Leadership, for which we're deeply grateful. She served for more than 6 years as a board member, as a host of the foundation's Uncovering Legacy Burdens of Racism panel discussion, as a guest on A Bridge Between Us, and as a co-organizer of the foundation's IFS Leadership Fellows Program and its IFS training component. Thank you for all these significant contributions, Requina. Through her varied experiences, Requina brings decades of professional wisdom, personal insights, and deep commitment to healing individuals and communities. And I'm sure she'll be the first to admit growth and learning continue. Again, Requina, welcome. What else would you like to add about you that would be relevant to our conversation today?
So a piece of my identity that is very important is that I am a mother of 3 beautiful children ranging from 30, then one in the middle, 17, and then an 8-year-old. And my children, they're brown children. And so I'm a mother, I'm a Black woman, half Latina, and I'm also a mother of 3 brown children. And so they influence my work, they influence my passion, and they influence the purpose that I have.
Well, thank you for sharing. God bless. But before we speak about racism or today's events, which we'll touch upon, I'd like to begin with something much more fundamental, Requina. When you hear the word dignity, what does it mean to you?
For me, it's basically having respect for one another in the world that we live in, respecting each other based off who you are, not based off of characteristics.
Who you are as a human being,
That's right.
The essence of your humanity. So given that, why do you believe, maybe it's obvious, but it's worth stating, why do you believe dignity is such a basic human need? And what happens to individuals and communities when such a dignity is denied?
Yeah. Well, I think particularly in today's world, 2026, the word in itself, dignity. Who is entitled dignity? Who is given dignity? And what does that even mean for us as a human race? So in regards to, again, me being in the body I'm in, for communities of color, Black communities, when we see dignity not being honored on screen, on video, in legislation, right? It's like, well, who has the right to have dignity and who doesn't? And who makes that rule? Right. And so I think it's an important word because it's so relevant to today's world and what's happening.
So if we can be more specific, look at our country today in particular. Where do you see dignity being affirmed and where do you see it being threatened?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I recently was watching a video of the new former president and first lady, the Obamas. I was watching the new center that they opened, and it brought me so much joy because it had me think about legacy. It had me think of how they have chosen to plant their legacy, not just in the world as far as being a former president, but also being people in the world and bringing that forward. And so I think for me, they're like the ideal public figures as far as dignity. And I think it's important because it shows the world that there is more to human race, but also us as a people. But particularly, I'll go even a step further as Black people. There is more for us in this world than sometimes is presented. And so I think it's those examples that make me feel proud and hopeful, particularly to be a Black woman, to see people do more than is what's in their scope, right? Going beyond. And I also think it gives me hope that everyday things like people holding the door for you, there's still good people in the world on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's those examples, whether it's, on a high level, like former president and first lady, or whether it's on a day-to-day level. Dignity is such an important thing that exists. And how do we demonstrate it? And I think that's just one example.
I hate to move away from this beautiful moment you just shared with us, this imagery that you gave us, the good feelings they generate for many of us. But I'd like to hear from you about moments, activities, situations. Where do you feel dignity is being threatened? This is
Yes.
not a political conversation, but we cannot
Yes.
ignore realities that we observe.
Right. So on the opposite side of dignity, right? So what is the opposite of dignity? For me, when I think of the opposite, it's like dishonor, disrespect. And so in opposition to dignity, I would say there's a lot of things, whether it's on social media or even everyday things, right? So I'll go high level, what we see happening in the world as far as who's dishonored, who does not get justice, right? Who's mistreated, who's disrespected, whose lives can just be put on camera and for everybody to watch like it's a sitcom or it's a movie. It's a joke. It's entertainment. Somebody being murdered is not entertaining. And so that's one example, right, of dishonoring or disrespecting a race or a people. And then there's low level too. There's just blatant disrespect, right? Like driving nowadays sometimes feels dangerous, right? Because you have people who are just so angry and aggressive and filled with isms that they can't even drive like a normal person, right? Their rage and their anger comes out on the road. So it's like, am I even safe to drive? Right. And I had somebody tell me a story recently of someone living in the South, a Black woman. She was driving on the highway and she had to pull over because somebody just was taking out so much aggression and rage on the road. So
Yeah.
it's those kind of situations where it's like disrespect and dishonor, but then also it being acceptable. Because when things do happen to Black and brown bodies, is there justice? Is there fairness? Is there a call to action as far as doing something about it and not just making excuses?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for sharing all that. My goodness, there are so many examples that we observe far away from us and in our own circles,
Mm-hmm.
where these efforts to show disrespect without feeling any shame about it, without feeling any concern about it, it's like almost
Mm-hmm.
become normalized in some places. But you're
Right.
right. There are so many good deeds that hopefully have maintained some counterbalance. And that's what
Right.
we hope to cultivate. So,
Right.
you know, I'm thinking of these racially charged times, and I would think you agree with me, they are racially charged because we find
Yes.
ourselves in a period that many of us experience increasingly polarized conversations, interactions around issues of race. Unfortunately, we've been here before. And we thought we'd started to address these issues, even minimally. Alas, it seems we may have started to go backward. At least in my opinion, it seems that way, and probably many others share that. So, from your perspectives, Requina, what concerns you most about this moment?
I think for me, it's the hatred and it's the anger that is fueled. If you have a race of people that are used to being led, and the main emotion or action is hatred, rage, fear, that becomes contagious. And so I think because we have a leadership in the country right now that tends to fuel fear, hatred, anger, conflict, that has become contagious. And that's the concern. And I also am an optimistic person. So I also feel like we're in a cycle.
Mm.
I feel like we are in a cycle that has gone through many generations with our ancestors, where you kind of get, when people are fearful, what do? They react. All right. And so, as a people, I'm just going to go back to Black people. as a people, we've gone through many cycles of suppression, injustice, racism. Not being honored. We've gone through cycles of that. And so what happens is once that fear takes over, it breeds hatred, it breeds conflict. But in time, what arises is a new version. It's a new version of the upcoming generation. It's a new version of the human race. So I really, truly believe we're in a cycle of hatred, anger, and it will pass. It's difficult to be living through it, but I do believe it's a cycle and our future generations will actually benefit. Unfortunately, just like our ancestors had to struggle, and we're benefiting from that.
Well, that's a very encouraging point of view. Thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share one aspect of your own experience that has influenced your own thinking about racism, especially systemic racism and our overall political and social cultures. Would you be comfortable sharing? Because it gives us greater context and it allows us to understand how, in spite of that experience, you seem to maintain hope and are working, diligently to change the reality around you.
Yeah, so I can speak to a couple of experiences I've had where I've dealt with racism or dishonor and disrespect. So there have been a couple. There have been some in educational environments, work environments, and also witnessing, right? The legal system, right? And so when I have been in a situation where I have either been dishonored, disrespected, or witnessed that, I think it's difficult because your system we're not taught as a people, right, how to navigate through racism and dishonor and disrespect. That's not something you're taught. That's something, unfortunately, you can be given knowledge about, but you actually have to figure out how to deal with the situation when you're in it based off of what it is. And so I think every time that I have been the receiver of racism, right, or some sort of ism, usually racism is the most common one, I can't take it personal because that is not my issue. That's the person who is inflicting that issue. What I can do is look at how it's impacting me. Based off of how it's impacting me, I get to choose how I want to proceed, right? So if it's in an educational situation where it did happen, I was in a class, I could have chosen to drop the class. I chose not to, right? And there was actually a benefit because one of the young women, she was from the South. This is when I was in grad school. She actually came up to me and said, based off of my voice and my advocacy and speaking to racism, she actually learned something from me. Now, I don't want to be the teacher of how not to be racist, but I think that's an example of how somebody can actually benefit from, unfortunately, me doing the emotional labor. So that's one example. In the workplace, if it's racism and it's making me uncomfortable or it's affecting me, I get to choose if I want to leave, if I have that choice, which is difficult. Do I feed my family or do I quit a job because somebody's being racist towards me, right? And then we have bigger systems like the legal system. That's a little bit more complicated because, there's power that's put in people's hands that are very racist and very biased. And you can't do anything about it because it's a legal system. It's a structure. It's systemic. It's set up for a purpose. So those are kind of examples that I've gone through as far as racism and dignity or lack thereof.
Well, thank you for that and for being open and vulnerable about it, and proud, right? I mean, you kind of recognize that you have pride in who you are, right? Healthy pride in your own legacy, in your own generational experience, and you're standing by that, and you're separating that from how other people are engaging. It doesn't mean there's no room for us to grow and learn and sharpen our perspective and enrich our experience. Yet there is something that is sacred about who we are as human beings, our essence. And I think it's wonderful to hear you say that, the issue becomes someone else's. And if you were to take it too personally, right, then you're basically empowering the other person to continue doing what they're doing in some fashion. And I know you cannot speak for other people, but I'd love for you to think with me, especially as someone who's experienced, the therapy from the therapist chair as well. Many people from other backgrounds feel uncertain, defensive, confused, or afraid of saying the wrong thing, right? What do you see or guess is happening inside of them when these things happen? Like, I mean, their thoughts, emotions, beliefs. What can you tell us from having interacted a lot with clients?
Yeah, I would say my experience is that when that happens, usually it is programming from childhood, right? They have this saying in recovery, don't feel, don't talk, don't trust, right? So it's like an ingrained programming, right? So I'm not saying we're computers, but I'll just use that for an example. When we're children, we're being programmed how to think, who to think, what to think, based off of the adults or the people around us. So that usually fear is put in children based off of their parents' experience or their grandparents' experience, or, even further back. Sometimes it's something that's just carried forward. And so if fear is put in the program, aka the child, or shame or guilt, that same programming does not go away when you become an adult. And so that same fear, for instance, let's say don't talk. We'll use that one. If I'm told as a child, don't speak up to authority, don't speak up to people who have privilege, guess what ends up happening? As an adult, I follow that same script. And so when there's an injustice or something unfair that affects me, do I even say anything about it? Or do I go based off of my script and say, if I speak up, I'm going to get in trouble? Usually it's the latter. If I speak up, I'm going to get in trouble. So therefore, I'm not going to speak up. I'm going to continue being affected. The person or people or environment that's affecting me does not know, maybe does not even care. Right. And so I think that's sometimes when it comes to people's influence or how they choose to address certain situations in adulthood, usually it goes back to what is their mindset? What were their thoughts and beliefs and behaviors as children? What was acceptable? What was not acceptable? And then as adults, how do they actually show up? For me, working with clients, it's not until people actually do some work on their own system that they're able to differentiate. This is like my young self. Let's say if we want to go into parts, this is my young part and this is my adult part. And the way my young part might respond is different than the way my adult part would respond. And this is how I would like to show up. And if I speak up, am I going to get in trouble? What are the consequences? Is it appropriate? All right. So that is kind of flipping the don't talk to speak up, advocate for yourself if it's safe, but also learn how to trust that you deserve what is best for you and not to go in hiding based off of fear. Because I think the fear is what keeps a lot of people as bystanders with injustice versus acting. And acting, you don't have to be, doing, I'll say marches or, rallies, but acting can be just volunteering. It could be a behind the scenes thing. And so I think a lot of people they have internal conflict about, okay, something's happening. What can I do? There's a lot of ways to serve and to help.
Right. Right. Yeah. Not everything is macro. There are a lot of micro pieces and then they pile up, they add
That's
up.
right.
So back to you and your own experience, when you're able to awaken the adult part in you and keep that adult aspect of you ready and prepared to respond. to all that goes on around you. When a situation becomes emotionally charged, and I'm guessing you've been in such situations, you've already shared a couple examples. Now that you have achieved that level of, let's say, maturity, emotional maturity around that space, what comes up for you? Like, see if you can walk us, gently. I say gently because we do not want to go into something extremely complicated when it comes to therapy. But what happens in your mind in that split second? Clearly, you've practiced that and you're able to get to the place where you prefer to be in. Could you walk us through that? What happens inside of you, inside your own mind, inside your heart, when the situation gets charged, so you can really respond in a way that keeps you whole and complying to your own sense of self and dignified presence?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my response based off of maturity and experience is not externally charged. Let's just say that. It's still charged for me when there's some sort of ism, particularly racism or injustice that affects me. I know as an experienced person, working with people and working with my own system, I know the consequences of reacting. And so when I am charged emotionally around racism, I try to detach and separate myself. I try to understand what's happening with the other person and have compassion for them. But that's a struggle at first, because my first thought is, how can you be like this? That's my first thought, particularly when it's somebody who's over 30 years old. Sometimes I have an assumption people should know better. People should do better. People should want to be better. And that's a judgment. However, I think most of the time it's more of a disappointment. When I have a situation that's emotionally charged around racism, it's like, you have not gotten to a place in this life to inquire your mindset, your thoughts, your behavior. You might never get to that place. But again, I don't take ownership of that. I kind of say, wow, you're a sad soul.
Well, a lot for us to learn there to be able to get to that place, because it's probably hard to remain open and curious when one's own identity, experience, or assumption feel challenged. You seem to have figured out a way to do that. And I'm sure there are traps, there are moments of fallibility, right? Um, what can you say about that when your own identity, experience, and assumption feels challenged? Do you still say, all right, it's the other person's issue, I'm whole, I'm untouched, and then proceed? You said you invited us to speak up if it's safe. So share some thoughts around that moment as you're deciding how to respond.
Yeah. I think that what I've learned when it comes to systems, systems aren't interested in hearing your voice. When you're a brown person, they really aren't interested in hearing your voice. There's a lot of assumptions that's carried with your voice. You're confrontational, you're argumentative, you're an angry Black woman. You don't know what you're talking about. You have no class. Right? There's all these assumptions that are piled on you that don't belong to you. And so yes, speaking up is necessary if safe. And when that doesn't work, what I have found, all you can do is stand in your truth and the rest will follow, and not from a naive or a woo-hoo, like, no. But if your voice is not heard, if you speak to it and it's not heard, okay, I said my piece, and now I have to trust that justice will prevail over time, that this person or community or system is going to encounter a situation that is not going to be so easy to manipulate or to project hatred and bias on. And that might not look like we think it might look, right? Like it might look in a way that they never thought of, right? Yeah. They might be in the hospital one day, and I'm just using this as an example, and they might have a Black doctor. And that black doctor is in charge whether they live or die. You spend your whole life and your whole career mistreating Black and brown people, children, families, communities. Now a Black doctor has a choice whether you live or die. I don't know the answer to that question.
Mm. Yeah, very, very fascinating thought process. Gedanken experiment, as we say in science, to think about, what happens in such situations. I mean, clearly, individual prejudice over time has contributed to systemic racism.
Yes.
Policies, the institutional decisions, the power structures, all that. And the civil rights movement, with all its successes, helped modify laws, which are not ironclad as we can observe today. Where they stopped short is maybe changing people's hearts. And maybe that's never anyone's job. People take responsibility for their actions and for their choices and for how they manifest their heart's desires and feelings. But I'm curious about your view, and I'm not expecting earth-shattering solutions here, just your own personal view about how we might change systemic racism over time, and what do we do about individual prejudice, if anything? Mm-hmm. Just your thought process. What comes to mind? What's your ideal place, destination to reach?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer the question backwards, if that's okay, because I think it starts from the beginning. So again, it goes back to childhood. It goes back to family. Those homes that children are being raised in is setting them up to behave and think and interact with people or not interact with people. The family members, the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, that's where that's where the soup starts to boil. So it's in those individual situations, it has to start from young. So is it in educational systems? Is it in home systems? I think it's all the above. Because it has to start individually to take that ownership. And then the system has to also, the people who are given power based off of skin color and sometimes identified gender cannot just get a powerful position based off of that anymore. There have to be systems in place that has equity and diversity and inclusion as a stamp across the board. And this is different from DEI. I'm not talking about DEI. I'm talking about diversity, real diversity and inclusion. All right. So it can't just be given to white men all the time because white men are part of the problem. Not all, but that has been part of the systemic issue. Because if these same people are taught hatred, discrimination, and racism, they get in positions of power, not always by qualification. Right? My uncle, my grandfather, right? It's all of that. That's why this systemic racism. Because it's the people who are put in power, have bias and prejudice and racism. And guess who they pass the torch to? Somebody else who has their same thought process. They don't say, let me give somebody else an opportunity. No. So that's how it continues. And systems actually benefit from this because this is how money also is incorporated. You look at any systemic racist system, there's money involved in there, always. We don't see it as the public, there's always money rolling around in there. Always. Unfortunately, the people who get caught up in that system, if they're Black and brown, are the ones that go to jail. That's not new. And so part of systemic racism, it will never end until there are other people that are put in position that actually are open-minded, good-hearted people, want the best for humans, and not just people who look like them. And I want to say one other thing. Racism is not only a Black and white issue. We hear this all the time. You can be a person of color and still demonstrate racism towards somebody else or prejudice, right? Sometimes it's internalized. You can be a Black and brown person and have internalized racism and hate your people or not like your people or put white people as superior. Again, another taught, learned behavior. So I just want to clarify that because it doesn't mean if somebody, let's say a Black person of color got a powerful position, if they have the same internalized racism, they're going to do the same exact thing. No. So systemic racism is perpetuated and promoted and continues because of the people that are chosen to be put in power. And it benefits them.
So what I'm hearing you say is that, yes, we can do some things to mask systemic racism by changing policy, by legislating new laws, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't disappear until individual prejudice is addressed. And, that's really our lifelong, our probably journey-long challenge as a human race. And history, when it comes to race, is fraught with pain and suffering, and that doesn't disappear. There's so much trauma that clearly it travels across generations. But to me, this is a critical aspect of our crisis today. And we somehow need to address it with great urgency. Do you see that the same urgency that existed in the 60s is needed today? And do you see it around you to help address the systemic, even mask it, as we work toward promoting, advocating for different ways of engaging with each other in ways that honor dignity and, like you said, so respect and honor?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I think of the 60s, right, it's like the people who chose to come forefront, right? Like the Martin Luther Kings and Marcus Garvey, the Malcolm X's, and kind of be at the forefront of the fight. I think the generation now, like let's say people, young adults, like maybe 18 to like mid 30s, right? they're very outspoken and very strong in what they believe in. I think it looks different because there's such a gap between who has power and who's advocating, right? So if the generation of 18 to mid 30s is the one speaking, the people who are in power in this moment are usually mid 60s plus. And so I think because there's that gap, the influence is there. And I think that there's a little power missing because in the 60s, the people who were advocating were at a certain level to be able to recruit people to take on the fight for the best or the right thing to do. Today's generation, they will come together collectively. And sometimes I think it's hard for the change to happen. So they advocate and they fight, but then when it comes to the change kind of going through all the way, like being followed through all the way, I think that's where sometimes there's a crossroad because the people in power aren't respecting them. Vice versa, the young people aren't respecting the older people. So there's like a middle generation that is probably the one who has the power, but you might not see as much visibly in the fight.
Yeah, it's an interesting point of view. I have to think about that a little bit and see what actually changed, because there were quite a few young adults in the civil rights movement of the 60s, right? I would have called them young adults then. Maybe they behaved differently, they engaged differently, and maybe the pain was more profound. I'm not sure. I just see significant difference in the level, intensity, and depth of the engagement now that I did before, and I've been curious about why that is. But we can talk about that at some other point. I'm interested actually in your experience on the other extreme. If you've had a situation where you felt you went too far in your response or assessment or judgment in a racially, intense moment that may have been, in your assessment later, not called for or not as effective. Um, can you think back of a moment like that and teach us what you learned from it?
That's another interesting question because I cannot recall a situation that somebody was being racist towards me and I reacted inappropriately.
Hmm.
I cannot recall. Yeah. I as long as I was aware of it or was something in my face or something I interacted with, I think I have always tried to advocate first. Um, Again, I'm a strong believer in justice. And when I feel there's injustice or I experience injustice, I'm like, yeah, this is not going to work.
Mm.
So that's an interesting question. Yeah.
I appreciate your giving it some thought and not landing on an answer. I certainly defer and accept your recollection of it. It's wonderful to know that. Just to extrapolate a little bit, how might we pursue justice then without allowing anger, without allowing fear, bitterness, or even despair to define us? Because, there is a certain rhythm, right, to responding to certain things. And there's also a human threshold that we might go beyond, right? Things might spill over if day after day after day after day certain things happen. But what you're telling me is there's a way to deal with this. And maybe these are the highest qualities of self-leadership that you and I aspire to. I'd like to hear more about that positive aspect of how we respond to things without allowing those strong emotions to take over.
Mhm. First, I want to say, is it exhausting? Yes. Is it frustrating? Yes. Does it bring anger? Yes. All of those things. Yes. And I think the wiser you get, and this might speak to the earlier question around that gap generation from like 35 to like 65, that's not really as active, because I think you learn based off of experience and wisdom how to interact with these situations, right? You learn how to not give your energy and time to certain things that ultimately aren't going to be beneficial. You learn how to approach certain situations. I have situations that still get me activated. But with time, with experience, you learn how to interact with these systems of injustice and situations of injustice, and learn how to preserve your well-being. Does that mean be passive and not say anything and not do anything? No. But you just pay attention to what makes most sense and what kind of outcome you want ultimately. And that's wisdom.
Clearly something to aspire to and work toward. Um, you know, I'm an even keeled guy usually, but I do fight against cynicism, my own, against jadedness, against apathy, because sometimes it's easier, much easier to go there than to stay in the fight in ways that, like we said a number of times already, honor the other person's dignity, that in ways that are aligned with highest human ideals. Help us help us stay on that road. How can we continue believing that meaningful change is possible when progress often feels painfully slow and slowly painful?
Yeah, I think it's important to have community, have family, have people who you can have difficult conversations with, have people who love you and care about you, staying connected, not isolating. Being able to have differences sometimes is a great thing, because then you can learn from each other, somebody in your community or somebody in your family, but really to immerse yourself in those spaces where you can speak to, have a voice, be seen. And that can actually hold you energetically for when you go into those other spaces, like the world, like sometimes a work environment, sometimes, a system, right? Having those spaces that you can go to for support and encouragement, and sometimes feedback or advice. So when you have to put your protector up and go into those systems, into the world, you're able to do that. Because that's part of a reality for a person of color. For the most part, I can speak from my experience. My protector is always up because it has to be.
You have to be defended, yes. Yeah. So say more and help us recognize, identify some practices that can help us remain grounded with full access to moral courage. You know, I'm hearing you talk about moral courage really without stating it. With full access to moral courage, to compassion, to caring, and practices that help us remain truthful to our values and beliefs during very difficult conversations and interactions.
Mm-hmm.
Say more, if you please.
Yeah, so I would say individually, if you have a practice, whether it be meditation, yoga, or faith, to really stay connected to what works for you individually and be grounded in that. Maybe it's outside resources like therapy or support groups. Stay grounded in that for individual. And then take it a step further, again, going back into external environments. What does that look like for you? Be able to identify things for yourself, at least 3 to 5 things for yourself that keep you grounded and keep you optimistic as much as possible. And then also transferring that to the outside, 3 to 5 things or places or communities that keep you grounded and make you feel safe so that you have a plan for yourself as you are exposed to things, whether it's on social media or the news or even everyday things. But you have a safe space for yourself, because I'm a true believer in this life. We all need somebody. We cannot do this alone. So what is it for you individually that you need? And what is it that you need on a more community external level? And be able to identify that and plug that into your daily life or your weekly life, whatever it looks like, and be committed and consistent with it.
Thank you, Requina. That's helpful on the individual level. Can we extrapolate it to the collective? Like, what would it look like collectively to respond? Whether it's a Black community or a Black cohort, or a brown cohort in a given system. We understand the individual response. How does that translate collectively?
Yeah, so collectively, I think it would be finding spaces. So I know in IFS, they have the Black Therapist Rock Training, which I was part of for 6 years, and being able to be in those spaces as a professional, but also personally. So that works on a professional level, but then there might be personal environments that you can be part of. There's a lot of environments already out there. And then one thing I would also suggest and recommend to listeners is, do you create a community that doesn't exist that you feel like you need? So collectively, how do you take action to join, or how do you take action to create? Or sometimes do both and.
Mm-hmm.
But put action in there.
Okay. So I'm curious how other people outside the Black community can partner up and be supportive to the Black community while learning for themselves, about the issues we've just discussed, because they have to show up in certain ways as well. And they're not expecting to be taught, but, by observing, by engaging, by listening, they can get to learn, and they'd like to be partners in that space. So how can people become trustworthy partners in building a more just future, right? I mean, many of us benefited knowingly or unknowingly, fairly or unfairly, from systems that have historically favored us. And we want to If there was a wrong done, if this was us being favored at the expense of someone else, we want to correct that wrong, you know? How can we become partners in this effort?
Yeah. I think it's important to become an ally. And being an ally, also being clear on what your intention is, so that the emotional labor does not happen. Because I think that happens a lot unconsciously when allies sometimes walk in the room, not all, but some come from good intention, but then there's emotional labor that ends up happening. So as an ally coming into the space, but knowing the intention that you have, talking to people, having conversations, not educational conversations, but actually human conversation, right? Being able to be in a space and not look for an explanation why, what, and how you're going to be in the space as an ally. That is not up for a person of color to define, to explain, to walk you through. As an ally, you have to come in whole, good intention, and be able to be committed to whatever the purpose is. And be confident in that. Because if you are, I'm not sure, well, maybe you're not ready yet. So I think that's where it goes back to individual. Where are you with race? Where are you with racism? Where are your parts at with injustice? Don't just tell me you're a person who's about being an ally. It's more to it than that.
Well said. Yes. As we come to a close, I'd like you to be thinking about some takeaways for our listeners to consider, almost like summing up key thoughts you shared. And I'm thinking particularly of parents, educators, employers, clergy, therapists, community leaders, because all of them shape the culture around us or help shape it, right? What would you invite them to do to help inspire communities where dignity is safeguarded and protected?
Mm-hmm. Have these conversations. Have these conversations in your classrooms, in your Sunday service, in your home, during dinner, during a car ride. Have these conversations and get curious about your own system. Get curious about dignity for you. How do you show up in the world? How do you treat other people? How do other people treat you? And get curious about that, but always have an open conversation, because sometimes there's an assumption based off of what somebody thinks or how they feel. And unless you ask them, you don't know. And so I think having these conversations and not being afraid to have these conversations, because these conversations actually can open more doors for other conversations that can be very important for individuals, families, couples, communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Requina. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today and for allowing us to start the conversation, at least take part in the journey of many conversations that are taking place around the country and the world on this topic. I think today's conversation reminds us that dignity is not an abstract idea. It's expressed in how we see one another, how we listen, how we speak, how we disagree, how we confront injustice, and how we choose to live together, right? Injustice might have different faces to different people, but having these conversations can allow us to maybe come up with a common view of injustice, or at least allow for personal experiences to define it and for us to hear that without prejudgment. History reminds us that progress has never come easy. Yet history also reminds us that ordinary people acting with courage, integrity, and compassion, and you mentioned some of them, Requina, on this call, have always helped bend society toward greater justice. Each of us has a role to play in our circles to do just that. Each of us has opportunities every day, you reminded us, to uphold dignity and integrity in our family spaces, our workspaces, our schools, our neighborhoods, our clubs, our communities, our places of worship. Those moments may seem small, but together they shape the kind of society we become. And I'm hoping that one day in our town halls and legislative halls, this will also become part and parcel of how we serve the greater well-being. I want to tell our listeners, thank you so much again for joining Facing the Moment. If today's conversation encouraged or challenged you, we invite you to continue listening, reflecting, trying to see through every interaction the other person's experience, the pains and joys, the struggle and deliverance. May we all uphold each other's dignity and attempt to build each other up. And please, friends, help sustain this podcast by donating what you can through foundationifs.org. Until next time, may we continue facing the moment with a bit of fortitude and abundant hope. And speaking of hope, Requina, having been in the therapy room, teaching classroom, or consulting roles, or from your own lived experience, what gives you hope and resilience at this moment?
My children.
Beautifully said. We have a lot to do to sustain their hope and offer them a world where they can thrive.
Yes.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Facing the Moment is an independent production of the Foundation for Self-Leadership, a nonprofit committed to bringing emotional, relational, and societal healing and well-being to a world in need. Learn more at foundationifs.org. You can download this and all other episodes on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Until the next episode, may we all keep facing the moment with grit and grace.